Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
If you have ever been told that the money simply is not there while you are quietly mapping out your future on the back of a grocery receipt and counting how many shifts your body can survive before it quits on you, then you already understand the kind of sentence that lands with a smile and a pat on the hand and still knocks the air out of your chest. Because when my mother said, "We love you, we wish we could help, we just cannot do it right now," I believed her with the kind of faith you reserve for the people who taught you how to cross the street and say please and keep your voice down at church. And I took that faith and translated it into extra applications and late nights, and a promise to myself that I would carry my own weight without making anyone else feel bad about it. So I picked the school that made the most sense for a kid without a safety net, and I filled out forms until the words blurred, and I learned that financial aid has a language that sounds helpful and somehow leaves you owing interest to people you will never meet. And I said yes to work-study hours that ate Saturdays and bled into Sundays, and I said yes to a roommate who collected dishes like souvenirs and never washed them, and I said yes to coffee that tasted burnt and life that tasted like waiting, and I did not say a word to my parents that sounded like blame, because I did not want to be that person who hangs a bill around someone else's neck and pretends it is a necklace. I juggled classes and shifts and the kind of decisions you only make when your bank account looks like a dare, and I bought used textbooks that smelled like old highlighters and other people's anxiety. And I learned which professors would let you submit at midnight without docking you, and which supervisors liked to remind you that a line out the door means you move faster no matter how many blisters you are hiding. And when the semester breaks came, I went home with a smile because I wanted to prove I was not bitter. I was just busy, and being busy was supposed to be noble, right? The kind of noble that makes parents proud and relatives nod like you are finally understanding how the world works. When I asked for advice instead of money, the room relaxed like a test had been passed, and I collected tidbits about discipline and grit as if they were coupons I could redeem for a smaller interest rate. And whenever someone said things like college is what you make of it, I nodded and made it into a job with another job strapped to its back, and at night, when I pretended my eyelids were not burning and my wrists were not aching, I told myself that every choice was building a door I would someday open with my own key, and I would not owe anyone a thank you they did not earn. The first time I heard the word law in connection with my brother, it sounded like a joke we all participated in, a family bit about how he could debate the paint-off offense. And it made us laugh through dinners where I kept the conversation light and the debt conversation absent. And when he actually sent a message that he was thinking of applying to a law program, I clapped and sent hearts and said go for it, because I wanted to be the kind of sister who cheers even when her feet hurt from standing all day, and he loved the attention and threw out program names like they were baseball teams and we were choosing favorites. By then I had become good at quick math no one could see, the kind you do when you hear a price and smile anyway, and I tucked away the thought that law school lives in a financial universe I do not visit, and I reminded myself not to be small, not to sound jealous, not to suggest that tuition is something you buy with magic, and I asked polite questions about applications and essays and internships, while whispering to myself that this was his lane and my lane was different, and that was fine. Because families do not owe their children equal dreams, they owe them equal honesty. When he got in, he called like a game show contestant who had guessed the right door, and everyone made noise, and my mother cried in a way I had not seen when I sent my own acceptance years before. And I told myself that joy is not a pie that runs out if someone takes a large slice, and I offered to help with moving and calendars and finding a decent apartment near campus. And I held my tongue when the conversation drifted into talk about how special this opportunity was and how doors open for people who take themselves seriously, because if I said what I was thinking it would turn the celebration sharp, and I did not want to be remembered as the person who could not let a good thing be good. The first sign that something did not add up was small enough to ignore, the way a drip in the ceiling becomes part of the house until the paint peels, and it came when he casually mentioned that the deposit was already handled, and that books were being pre-ordered, and that he had a laptop that could run anything without freezing, and he said it with the confidence of someone who has never had to call a bank to beg a fee reversal, and I laughed along because that is what you do when you are raised to keep the peace. Yet there was a flicker of confusion that would not sit down no matter how nicely I asked. Later, my parents started floating little phrases that felt like trial balloons, comments about how every child is different and support looks different for each one, and anecdotes about friends who helped one kid more than another, because that is how timing works. And I found myself nodding along while my ears rang with the echo of "we wish we could help, but we cannot right now," and I remembered how quickly the conversation had closed when I was the one drowning in fees, and I wondered when exactly the tide had turned, and whether it had ever moved at all. I kept my face open and my voice calm while I adjusted my schedule to cover another semester's costs, and I offered cheerful updates that did not mention debt while the family group chat buzzed with my brother's plans. And I clapped for internship interviews and texted him reminders about forms, and every time I typed good luck, I heard little footsteps of doubt running up the stairs in my head. Because the way he spoke about money sounded like someone describing weather they had never been caught in, and every mention of tuition landed soft, like it had a cushion underneath it. The weekend that hooked me by the throat came when I stopped by the house and found a stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter with his name and a school logo that does not send mail unless it is about something real. And my father swept them into a drawer like that was normal and changed the subject to a podcast about discipline and grind. And my mother asked if I wanted leftovers, and my brother breezed in talking about casebooks like he was ordering lunch. And in that jumble of normal, I felt something sturdy shift under my feet, because for the first time I saw the outline of an answer I did not want, and I realized there might be a reason he spoke so lightly about bills. And I knew I was about to learn whether the sentence they had given me years ago had a second half they never said out loud. The envelopes in the drawer would have stayed a blur in my memory if the words on my mother's speakerphone had not floated down the hallway like a reminder you cannot unhear. Because once you recognize the cheerful cadence of a bursar confirming that a tuition payment has posted and that the remaining balance is zero, the brain stops pretending that coincidences are just friendly strangers and starts taking names. And I stood there trying to make my face do the calm thing while my chest did the thudding thing, replaying that old gentle sentence, "We love you, we wish we could help, we just cannot right now," and setting it beside this new shiny sentence that translated to "we can help, we already did." And the contrast felt like someone had swapped out a picture in a frame and expected me not to notice. I did the polite shuffle back into the kitchen with the practice smile that says I am fine and I am not prying, and please nobody ask me anything that requires a straight answer. And when my father started talking about discipline and personal responsibility, I almost laughed out loud because the irony was trying to crawl out of my mouth. Yet I kept it in and nodded and asked about the podcast like a good daughter who never minded paying for her own life, and then my brother waltzed in with that breezy confidence people develop when money is the floor they walk on and not the ceiling they keep hitting their head against. And he said something about casebooks being ridiculous, but at least he did not have to stress, because the school and the family had everything handled, and that phrase sat there on the table like a glass nobody touched even though everyone saw it. I told myself not to jump to conclusions because Fury likes fast answers, and I have learned that fast answers burn hot and fade quick, so I went looking for slow answers that stick, and it turned out they were everywhere if you knew the sound to listen for. Tucked into my mother's offhand comment about how some kids need a little more runway, folded into my father's proud story to a neighbor about investing in potential, stranded in a text from my aunt who wrote, "Can you believe how generous your parents are being with his program, because not every family steps up like that," and when I read it twice and put my phone down I felt something clean and sharp line up in my chest. Because there it was in plain language from someone who was not trying to sell me a narrative about timing and fairness and different children having different needs. There was the truth I had suspected and tried to bury under grace. The next piece slid into place when I asked my mother a question I already knew the answer to, casual as a weather check, whether my brother needed help figuring out the health forms or the payment portal, because those things can be tricky the first time. And she gave me that soft voice reserved for toddlers and social workers and said, "It is already handled, darling. We do not want him distracted by nickels and dimes when he needs to focus on the big picture." And I heard the unspoken footnote that had never been offered to me, the idea that my attention was dispensable and his was precious, and in that moment the story I had told myself for years collapsed in on itself like a tent with a snapped pole. I wanted to explode, to throw my ledger of shifts and interest and bone-deep fatigue onto the table and ask for a cross-examination worthy of his future profession. Yet something stronger than anger put a hand on my shoulder and told me to stay quiet for a minute longer, because shouting would give them the ending they wanted. The one where I prove I am emotional and ungrateful and confused about how family resources are just complicated, and instead I made a choice that felt like ice water down my spine. I decided to treat the truth like evidence and not gossip, to catalog, to archive, to remember every sentence they used to decorate this decision, so I could put it back on the shelf in a new frame when the time came. I started with the facts that no one could deny: the confirmation email my mother left open on her tablet with a subject line that included the words "payment received" and the exact program name. The check images in their banking app that flashed across a notification banner, because my father never learned how to silence those. The receipts tucked into the drawer beneath the placemats with notes in my mother's handwriting that said "first semester complete" and "books ordered," and I took a picture of each one with hands that trembled less than I expected, not because I planned to wave them around, but because I needed my own eyes to stop gaslighting me into thinking I had invented a slight that was not there. When he joked at dinner that at least he would graduate debt-free unless he developed a taste for expensive suits, the table laughed, and I looked at my parents and saw relief and pride shining like they had rescued a stranded traveler on the side of the road. And I felt a familiar stubbornness harden in me, because I did not need a rescue, I needed honesty, and if I could not have honesty, then I would have something else I could live with, which turned out to be distance, the kind that begins small and private and grows only when watered by entitlement. So I made my first move, not loud and not theatrical, just deliberate and precise. I texted my brother that I would not be able to help him move that weekend after all, because work had shifted and I had to cover some hours. And I sent my parents a separate note that said I wish I could, I just cannot right now. The exact wording they had given me years ago, sent back like certified mail with no apology attached. And within minutes his messages started coming in with a mix of annoyance and confusion and a little guilt peppered in for flavor, while my mother asked if everything was okay, and I said yes, because it was. Perhaps for the first time in years it truly was. The satisfaction was not fireworks, it was steadier and more useful, like turning a valve and watching the pressure drop to a level that will not blow the system, and it taught me that I did not have to break anything to make my point. I just had to stop volunteering to be the cushion that made everyone else comfortable, and when my father called to suggest we could reschedule the move because family helps family, I let the silence do the work until he changed the subject on his own, and then I pressed save on every screenshot and tucked them into a folder I named Decisions, so I would never again let someone rewrite my memory for me. By the time the weekend rolled around and they hired movers and paid rush fees and grumbled about availability, I was busy stacking my own hours into a wall between me and the version of me who had once believed that fairness was something you earned with good behavior. And I closed the night with a cup of cheap coffee and a calm I did not recognize, because I finally accepted that the story was not about scarcity, it was about choice, and the people who taught me about responsibility had made theirs, and now I had made mine, and while they were still congratulating themselves on a sacrifice that apparently only hurt in the abstract, my phone lit up with a new message that changed the shape of what would happen next. A bright little bubble from my mother that read, "Can we talk tonight about something important?" And I knew with the kind of certainty that does not brag that the conversation they were about to start would be the one they wished they had never invited me into. When my mother said we should talk about something important, I already knew the cadence it would take, because there is a rhythm families use when they are about to ask for another favor while calling it unity. And sure enough, she started with the soft compliments about how organized I am and how well I manage people and how lucky my company is to have me, which eased into the real ask so smoothly I could have missed it if I were not already listening for the moment she would try to turn my backbone into a bridge, because what she wanted, couched in talk about opportunity and how connections matter and how we all do our part, was for me to introduce my brother to a partner I know so that he could slide into a summer position without having to compete the way I have competed for every inch of ground I stand on. And she layered it with a suggestion that he might crash at my place once or twice during finals, so he could have quiet and a good home-cooked meal, and she delivered the kicker. With a smile, I could hear through the phone that this would be our little family team effort and that I should not get hung up on details like money because their support for him is temporary and my independence has always been such a point of pride for them. I asked a simple question that did not feel simple to them, whether she could say out loud, in clear words, that they were paying for his law program while telling me years ago that they could not help with my tuition. Because I needed to make sure we were all living in the same reality before I considered lending my name to anything. And she responded with the classic spin that support looks different for each child, and that I had scholarships and grit, and that they had always admired my resourcefulness, which did not answer the question and did not even come close. And when my father chimed in on speaker with that measured tone he saves for office calls about how this is not about keeping score and how families invest where the return is most critical at the moment, I heard the arithmetic they would rather not show me. The kind that treats a daughter's sacrifices as character building and a son's ambitions as assets to be financed. While they talked in equal parts nostalgia and instruction, my phone lit with a new message from my brother that made my cheeks flush hot in a way I have not felt since high school. A breezy little note that said be a team player and stop doing the martyr thing because no one asked you to suffer, followed by the happy face he uses when he thinks he is charming. And I stared at it until the letters stopped pulsing, and then I put the phone face down and let my parents finish their sentence about how none of this is personal and how they love both of us equally, and I realized that if I raised my voice even a notch I would be reduced to the stereotype they already keep in their back pocket for times like this. The oversensitive daughter who makes everything about fairness when grown-ups know life is complicated. So I made a different choice that felt like pulling a ripcord on a shoot I had been sewing for years without admitting it. And I said calmly that I could not introduce him to anyone at my firm because our policy on conflicts of interest and nepotism is strict, and because I would not risk my standing to grease a path for someone who has not learned the difference between entitlement and preparation. And before they could pivot to guilt, I added that I had already filed a written disclosure with compliance stating that I would not sponsor or vouch for relatives for internships, referrals, or shadowing, which meant there would be a paper trail if anyone tried to use my name anyway, and I said it the way they taught me to say important things clearly. Without apology, then let the silence stretch long enough to become awkward. My father tried a strategy change and offered the greatest hits of parental accounting, reminding me that they covered braces and car insurance in high school and that I always had a bed at home and a full pantry, which I did not contest because none of that was untrue. It was just irrelevant to the moment where he wanted me to pretend a major financial decision had not happened. And when my mother sighed and said she hated when money came between people who love each other, I told her that money was not coming between us, decisions were, and that the only thing I was asking for was an honest sentence acknowledged out loud, and when they refused to speak it I understood that I would have to supply a different form of clarity. I crafted a message to the family group that read as if it were purely logistical and not confrontational, because tone matters when you intend to move pieces without breaking the board. And I wrote that scheduling for my brother's summer plans and housing would be best coordinated directly with our parents, since they are covering tuition, books, deposits, and incidentals, so they will know the timelines and commitments. And I hit send knowing the aunt who had already texted me about their generosity would see it along with the cousins who love family news, and I watched the read receipts roll in like lights turning on down a hallway that had been dark for too long. And in the quiet that followed, I felt the floor level under my feet in a way it had not in years, because I had refused to carry the weight of their secrecy any longer. The responses came in stutters and corrections and emojis that I ignored, my mother calling immediately to say that I had misunderstood and made them look showy when they are simply doing what any parent would do. And I said gently that the message contained no judgment and only facts, that I had used her words and the bank's receipts and nothing more. And my father grumbled about airing private matters, which was funny given how public the praise had been when it served their narrative, and my brother sent a string of accusations about jealousy and sabotage and how I was ruining his first year before it started, and I let each one pass by like a bus I did not need to board. Then I delivered the actual revenge tucked inside a boundary that looked boring from the outside, but felt like a detonation to me. because I withdrew my name from the alumni referral pool my company maintains for law internships, and I sent an internal note that any message invoking my name for my brother should be flagged to compliance as unauthorized. And I forwarded the acknowledgement to myself and saved it next to the screenshots in the folder labeled Decisions, and only then did I text my mother a sentence that matched the exact structure she had used on me back when I was juggling work and debt and pride, telling her I love you, I wish I could help, I just cannot right now, and I meant every word. And while I was still holding the phone, it buzzed with a new email that made my stomach drop and my shoulders square at the same time. A cheery automated note from my company's applicant tracking system that someone had submitted a summer application listing me as a personal reference, which told me my brother had decided to use my name anyway, and in that instant I knew exactly how I would answer in a way that would leave a mark without leaving a mess. The automated email sat at the top of my inbox like a dare, not because it was mean or dramatic, but because it was exactly the kind of cheerful corporate template that pretends everything is neutral. And it informed me that a candidate had listed me as a personal reference and that my input would help the hiring committee evaluate fit, which would have been routine if the candidate were not my brother using my name after I had said clearly and in writing that I would not sponsor him. So I opened the compliance portal, attached the screenshots of our texts, pasted the policy line about family referrals and conflicts that I could recite in my sleep, and submitted a formal note that I had not consented to be listed, that I would not be providing a reference, and that any attempt to contact me for endorsement should be routed back to compliance for record-keeping. And then, because I have learned to finish what I start, I clicked the link in the email and wrote a single sentence to the hiring team stating that my name was used without permission and that I would not be recommending the applicant, which took less than a minute and yet felt like finally taking my hand off a hot stove I had been too polite to move away from. The fallout started faster than I expected, with my brother sending the kind of messages people write when they are sure they can talk you into undoing your boundaries if they stack enough annoyance on top, while my father called to remind me that family builds bridges, not walls, and my mother tried the softer route about how surely the policy is more of a guideline and how this could be our little exception, and I stayed with the one sentence that would not budge, telling each of them that I was protecting my job and following the rules they raised me to respect, and when they tried to shift the lens to loyalty and generosity, I said I was being loyal to the person who pays my rent and generous with the truth, which earned me a long, offended silence that I did not rush to fill. The next morning brought another bright auto message advising me that the application had been withdrawn by the candidate, which was a relief because it meant my internal note had not become an ugly scene. And I closed my laptop and sat with the quiet satisfaction that comes from doing something clean and unambiguous without setting anything on fire. Then I opened my phone and muted the family group because I could not keep pouring myself into a conversation where my reality was treated like a mood, and I promised myself that the new rule would be simple and boring and final, that I would not volunteer, not cushion, not host, not smooth, and that if anyone wanted to know how I was doing they could schedule a call rather than treating me like an always-on help desk. Work did not pause to accommodate my personal epiphany, which turned out to be perfect, because projects ramped up and I took the lead on a client that had been circling back to us for months, and I negotiated timelines in language that was crisp and fair. And when the quarter closed with better numbers than expected, my manager asked how I wanted to be recognized, and I said out loud, without flinching, that I wanted a title adjustment and a salary correction, and I made the case with receipts and outcomes rather than charm, and when the approval came through 2 weeks later, I did something I had been planning for years without letting myself believe it would arrive. I paid the final chunk on my student loans, watched the balance slide to zero, requested the paid-in-full letter for my records, and then closed the browser without telling a soul because I wanted this to be mine, not a performance, and I sat there thinking about the years where I had measured my worth in late fees avoided and plastic forks saved from takeout. It is strange how fast a boundary starts to feel like air rather than armor, because once I put distance between their needs and my reflex to fix, little choices followed that might look petty from the outside and yet felt like repairs from the inside. Like removing my parents as my emergency contacts and listing my friend Maya who actually answers the phone, like unsubscribing them from the automatic calendar updates I used to send whenever I traveled because if they needed logistics they could ask, like declining to be the default driver for family errands by saying I am not available rather than offering a list of alternate dates, and each tiny refusal stitched itself into a larger fabric where I did not disappear in order to keep the peace. They noticed, of course they noticed, even while pretending not to, and the pretense lasted exactly until my mother called with the voice she uses when she wants to skip steps and go straight to the part where I say yes. And she told me that bar prep was shockingly expensive and the apartment near campus had raised the rent and the deposit had to be increased, and that the timing was bad because some investments were tied up. And she used the classic little phrase we have always used for emergencies. Could you float this just for a while? And my father added that it would be a family loan, not a gift, and that I would be proud to have helped when my brother passed the exam. And they both waited for me to do the old math where I carve myself thinner to make room for someone else to stretch. I did new math instead, the grown kind that counts history alongside dollars, and I said with a level voice that I could not help, that I wished I could, that I loved them, that I could not. And I let the exact cadence sit there because I knew they would recognize their own words dressed in my voice, and when they shifted from surprise to indignation to that quiet punitive calm, I did not chase any of it. I simply said that they had made their choice about how to distribute support and I was making mine about how to distribute access, and then I ended the call before the debate could start. And a few minutes later another email landed that was not from work and not from a lender, but from the State Bar's Character and Fitness Committee requesting that I confirm I had known the applicant for many years and could speak to his integrity. Which I stared at for a long, slow minute, because it was not a question from my family anymore. It was a request from the system they had used to elevate him, and it was going to force me to decide how far I was willing to go to protect my peace and my principles, and I understood that whatever I wrote next would tell the rest of the story whether I meant it to or not. The message from the Character and Fitness Committee did not arrive like a threat or a warning so much as a test of whether I meant what I had been telling myself about choosing evidence over outrage, because it asked in that precise institutional tone whether I could speak to my brother's honesty and reliability. And I sat there understanding that I could do the easy family thing and type a breezy endorsement that would make the next few months simpler for everyone, or I could do the harder adult thing and answer with the clean truth that I was not a suitable reference and that recent conduct had made me unwilling to vouch for his integrity, and once I named the choice that way the decision stopped wobbling and stood up on its own. I wrote carefully because I know how words behave once you release them into official channels, saying that I had known the applicant for his entire life in the general sense that siblings do, that I cared about my family, that I could not provide the requested character statement without a conflict of interest, and that in the last season I had reported to my employer an incident in which my name was used as a reference without my knowledge or consent after I declined to sponsor the applicant due to policy, and I offered to furnish the compliance acknowledgement and the email trail directly to the committee if needed, and I closed by stating that I wished the process fairness and transparency for all candidates, which was the truest sentence I could write without stepping into drama or accusation or anything that could be mistaken for revenge. I sent it and sat in the kind of quiet that feels like a heavy door catching its latch, and within a day the committee replied with a neutral request for supporting documentation, which I provided without commentary or color, just the facts in order. And somewhere between attaching the screenshots and confirming my phone number for follow-up I noticed that my hands were steady and my breathing was normal, and the old familiar dread that used to arrive whenever my family's needs bumped into my boundaries simply did not show up, and that told me more than any congratulatory text ever could. The consequences began to ripple in ways I had predicted and in ways I had not, because his file was moved to additional review and his dean of students reached out to him about the inquiry. And his internship applications were quietly paused by the firms that wait for the committee's clearance before bringing a candidate into the building. And the bar prep timeline that my parents had assumed would run like clockwork started slipping by weeks that cost real money and even more pride, and the calls came in waves, first confusion, then pleading, then the kind of brittle civility people use when they want to shame you without risking a quote, and each time I said the same thing in the same calm tone, that I had told the truth in the forum that asked for it, that I had not made any accusations beyond what the email showed, that I hoped he would learn what the profession he chose requires before he took an oath he could not carry. There was a moment when my mother tried to rewrite the ask by saying that a sister's words should tilt toward forgiveness, because family history is complicated. And I answered that forgiveness is not the same as certification and that the committee's question was specific, and my father shifted to the ledger of old household generosity as if braces and casseroles were currency I could redeem for silence. And my brother sent a message that tried to be both charming and threatening, a combination that used to work on me when I wanted peace more than clarity, but now it just sat there like a sales pitch I did not need, and I let it age into irrelevance without a reply. I performed the smallest and most satisfying piece of revenge I have ever designed by returning, through certified mail, and with a short note, the spare key to my parents' house that I had kept on my ring since high school. Writing that I was removing myself from emergency contact lists and family logistics, and that any future requests should be put in writing and sent to my email because I would no longer take on surprise obligations or last-minute rescues. And I made sure the language was courteous, specific, and final, and when the delivery confirmation pinged my phone, I felt the quiet thud of a boundary becoming a wall that did not need to be policed to stand. Work kept happening because life does not pause for family theater, and the promotion paperwork finished moving through the system, and I booked a modest trip I had postponed for years without announcing it to anyone. And on the first morning I woke without the old reflex to check whether someone in the group chat needed a ride or a payment or a favor dressed up as tradition. I realized that the victory I had been chasing was not a dramatic courtroom scene or a viral story about comeuppance, but the ability to plan my day without factoring in a lie someone else told me about what they could not afford to give. When the committee called for a final clarification, I repeated what I had already said and added nothing new, because the point was never to bury him. It was to stop participating in a story that required me to vanish so that he could be presented as pure potential, and the investigator thanked me for my time with the same professional warmth I had offered, and we ended the call. And I knew that whatever outcome arrived would belong to him and to the choices he and our parents had made, not to my willingness to keep secrets that hurt me. In the days that followed, I sent one last message that took me an hour to shape and exactly 1 minute to send, a short, even-tempered note to my parents that I would be stepping back indefinitely, that I would not attend holidays or milestones until there was an acknowledgement in plain words of what had happened and a plan for how our relationships would function without hidden ledgers and unspoken hierarchies. And I turned off read receipts because I did not need to watch the struggle play out in dots and delays, and I put my phone face down and went for a walk that had no destination other than being a person in her own life. People always want a final answer, a clean ending, a verdict they can cheer for, and I will tell you what I can without pretending to be a judge. Which is that months later I heard through a cousin that the committee had cleared my brother after an admonition and an ethics module, which is not a scandal and not an exoneration. It is a record that will follow him if he listens for it. And by then the only part of the story that mattered to me had already concluded, because I did exactly what I promised myself I would do on the day my mother's receipt drawer told on all of us. I stayed silent when shouting would have made me small. I told the truth when asked by the only people who needed to hear it, and I closed the door so gently it made no noise. Then locked it from my side and put the key in a drawer I do not open, which is not cruel and not dramatic and not even complicated. It is simply the final move in a plan that required only one thing from me that I had never allowed myself before: the belief that walking away can be the loudest thing a person ever says.